Good morning. Oh, it's freezing. Oh my god, it's said to be about -5, -6 today. And I believe it, looking through to the cab right now. I haven't opened the door yet because I'm just trying to get the burner on, trying to get it warm in here. Today's mission is going to be installing a battery to battery charger. If you saw in an earlier video, I fitted a split charge relay, which is a kind of budget way of charging off of the alternator from the van. But a much more effective way is a battery to battery charger, which is considerably more expensive, but it's going to give me a lot more power, and it's healthier for the batteries. So essentially a split charge relay is just a block that detects current from the van battery and then feeds it through to the leisure batteries and charges them. But the alternator doesn't really know what power to give out, it just throws out like 14.5 volts or something like that. Whereas a leisure battery, in order to charge, you have the bulk charge, which would be around 14 point something volts. But then once it gets to like 80-90% charged, it needs a trickle charge, which, if I'm understanding it correctly, the alternator doesn't do. Technically, with a split charge relay, I don't think you can ever charge your batteries at over 80%. Whereas a battery to battery charger takes that power from the alternator, then adjusts it to whatever the leisure batteries need. So not only does it keep the batteries healthier, it charges them faster and it charges them to 100%. The cost difference, a split charge relay kit with a 5-meter cable set up will cost about 70 quid. The battery to battery charger that I've got, which is a 60 amp charger, I think it costs me about 250 quid. So it's quite a difference, but it's said to charge around 3 times the pace, and like I say, it's healthier and all the rest. So today's mission is installing that, because at the moment my batteries aren't holding quite enough charge. Because I'm parked in the yard, the sun's coming round and it's kind of behind the barns until about now, which is about 1 o'clock, which means I'm missing the first 3 or 4 hours of sunlight. And really I'm only getting from 1 o'clock until 4 o'clock. I'm currently getting 12.8, even though it doesn't look like a 12. Annoyingly, that middle bit of the LED screen is buggered. But because there's a bit of solar, I'm getting 12.8, but at night, I'm very quickly dropping down to about 12.2. Basically, I need to get this system in so that I can run the van and it'll charge the batteries up, because they've been sat around 12.3, 12.2, which is like 60 to 50%. So basically I've got 2 extremely thick cables running from the front to the back of the van, and I'm going to get it all connected up and explain the diagram that came with it. I've looked through the specifications on the battery to battery charger and I've bought exactly what it suggests, with the fuses, with the cables, everything. So without further ado, we'll get stuck in and install this battery to battery charger, which will be an absolute game changer for my leisure batteries. So there's my system in its current state. It's been that long since I've worked on it now. Basically what I have is the Renogy 60 amp DC to DC battery charger. Don't quote me exactly, but I think it was around 250 quid. It needs connected to the van battery and it needs connected to the leisure batteries. And then there's also some settings on it which are done using these. Sorry about the wound on my finger. Bloody axed myself, didn't I? Note to self, never cut wood in the dark. So there it says input, so that's where we're going to take the cables from the van battery, connect into that side, and therefore this is the output. So these 2 cables are going to connect to my leisure batteries. And if you've seen my previous videos, this is the connection point for the live and this is the connection point for the negative, because you always want to connect to different batteries, the furthest in the system basically, so they'll drain at the same rate. So the thing we need to discuss in this video is cables. That's the most important thing, because this is such a high power device, it really does run the risk of going horribly wrong. And it doesn't come with a kit. A lot of the stuff I've bought has come with a kit. So for example, the inverter came with its own cables, so that wasn't a problem. The split charge relay that I fit and then removed, it came with all its own cables. So I've got these 2 cables here. Even though they look like different thickness, they are both 25mm square cable. If you can see there, on the black one 25mm square and on the red one 25mm square. These come from the van battery in the front and need to be connected to this device. The more power that's going to run through the cables, the thicker they need to be, otherwise they get hot and they melt and they catch fire. If you were to run really thin cables, they would immediately catch fire. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the instruction manual that came with this and tell you why I've chosen 25mm square. And then on the output, you actually don't need as thick a gauge. So these are 6 AWG, which, because that's a different metric of measuring, I'll put the millimeter squared right here. And yeah, I'll explain why that is as thick as it is as well. So let's have a look at the manual. Obviously it's got all the normal information, diagrams and what you get with it. Mounting, it's really important. These things get quite warm, so you need to mount it with airspace. Luckily for me, I have tons of room in here. I kind of like the idea of mounting it on the slats in this build, because the airflow through them will keep it nice and cool. But what we're really looking for is this diagram here. This is the most important part. It's obviously an instruction manual for the 3 different models that they do. That's the 20, 40 and 60. So that's referring to the ampage. I have the 60 amp. I'm referring to these 2 rows here. You'd obviously look at whichever one applied to yours. The longer a cable, the more current it needs to carry. See here, you've got 6 AWG and then it jumps up to 4 AWG when it gets longer. So the DC input from the starter, so this is coming from the van battery, it needs to be 4 AWG, which is my 25mm square. I'm traveling a distance of about 5 meters, so I come in this column, even though they're all the same anyway. 4 AWG is going to do me just fine. Then for the output, which is from the device to the batteries, depending on how far that distance is, you'll also need to choose the applicable cable. For me, it's going to be less than a meter, so it definitely falls into the lower end of this category. So that's 6 AWG. The next thing to look at is also the fuses. So we need a 90 amp fuse near the van battery, and we need a 75 amp fuse between the charger and the battery bank. So I've already bought these and I'll hunt these 2 fuses out. Cables I've already bought, and like I say, I've ran these 2 through from the starter battery, not connected, we'll do that in a minute. They're going to go into this side of the device, and then out of this side we've got the thinner, slightly thinner cable that's going to connect to the batteries. You'll notice that I've already went ahead and put these cables on. I've simply just put a couple terminals on, crimped them on, wrapped them in electrical tape and bolted them in. So I'm just going to do the same with this side now, taking these 2 cables, strip them off, put terminals on, wrap them in tape and connect them on. Of course, it's important to get these the right way around. There's a minus there for the negative and a positive there. So red for positive, black for negative. And I'll be doing the same on this side. Then, once that's hooked up, it's almost ready to be connected to the battery, but the thing you need to do before that is this. This is basically how you calibrate the device for the batteries that you have. Because different batteries require different voltages, you need to tell this what it's working with, because it can do lithium, it can do lead acid, it can do AGM. So you have to make sure and get the right amount, because lithium, if I'm right, takes a much higher voltage than AGM, and AGM can take higher voltage than lead acid. The final cable that we're going to need is this. It's the D+ port. So then we have the D+ ignition wiring, and in it, it suggests 18 to 16 AWG. So the higher the number, the thinner the cable. So we want to go with the lower number, especially because it's going to be traveling 5 meters. So we're better being on the safe side. So I've got some 16 AWG cable, which I'll be running from that D+ port through to the van battery. The first thing I'm going to do is get that ignition sensing cable, the D+ ignition wiring, installed through to the van. So we'll have 3 cables running, the positive and negative of the 4 AWG cable, then also the 16 AWG, which is going to connect into the D+ port. I might be repeating myself, but it's so important that you get these cables right. This is a very high powered device and therefore could go horribly wrong. So stick to the manual. If you haven't got the Energy one, then you need to look in the manual, but it'll translate very much the same. There'll be a diagram or some sort of wiring information. Stick to it. Don't go outside of it. So here we are in the cab. That's the live that's going to come from the battery to the battery charger, which I've already got a terminal on because I did that a wee while ago. I haven't done the negative yet. I also have this cable, but it actually comes from the leisure batteries, and it's going to be used to wire up some devices and chargers and stuff in the front. So if you've seen an earlier video, my battery sits under here, so I've got plenty of cable to connect to that. And then here's that cable that I'm going to connect to the D+ port, or whatever it was called. There's plenty of it. I think it might even be 10 meters this. Either way, what I'm going to do is lay one end down. I might actually just tie it through that so it doesn't move. And then I'm going to feed it along with the other cables, which go through the bulkhead and then along that back wall and then under the bench into the battery bank, which is back there. I'll feed that in now and I'll catch you in the back of the van. So there it is, that cable coming through. Like I thought, I've got tons of excess. Oh, I'll tell you what it's called today. Put a plaster on so you don't have to keep looking at my minging wound. But my hands are so cold. Not a good day to do this. So all I'm going to do now is cut this a bit shorter, but I need to keep in mind that these 2 go into that side and this goes into this side, so this needs to be slightly longer than them. But yeah, I'm going to cut all 3 of these and get terminals on the end of those 2. This one doesn't need a terminal. You just strip the wire, put it straight in and tighten a tiny little screw in there. And remember, when you're putting a terminal on, to always take the screw or the nut off and then check your terminal sizes. You need to make sure that it can hold all of the wire so it needs to be probably nice and wide like these ones, but that bolt or screw, whatever it is, needs to also fit through it. So I'm going to check that, pick the best terminal, strip them, crimp them on, wrap it in tape. See you in a sec. The input and the output. What I'm going to do now is mount this on the wall because I don't want to cut these until I know how long they need to be, and I'll also need to be installing a fuse on that live cable. So let's get it mounted. I've decided I'm going to fit it here because it beats the slats nicely, and then the cable comes in here and it goes out here to the battery. I could have it anywhere in this space, but I'm going to have it so that the cables come out about the height of the top of the batteries, because that'll make the most use of the cables. So I'm talking about having it there. What I am going to do is have a couple washers under each leg between the wood, just for a little bit more space. I mean, this is highly ventilated. What I have realised though is once I screw this in, it's going to be hard to put that D cable in. So what I'm going to do now is actually just bring this around and cut it to length and get it wired in, because I need to get a screwdriver into that edge, which I won't be able to do because of this leg here. So as I said, this one doesn't need a terminal, it just needs stripped off a little bit. I can't imagine it goes very far into the device. So I'm just going to do about 8 or 9 mil of that twist, and then I'm just going to feed it into the D plus side. It actually feeds quite far in, so I'm just going to take another couple mil off. I'm going to go straight in there, and then using quite a small flathead screwdriver, give that a tighten. Right, that's good. Notice there's a port next to the D plus. It's called the LC. This is to do with halving the ampage of this device, which I'm not really sure why you'd do that. If you bought a 61, I don't know why you'd want to half it into a 30 when you could have just bought the 40 or the 20. But I don't know, maybe in the comments you can let me know where that comes in useful. Anyway, we're going to talk about these little pegs. So basically what we have is 5 different switches. You can see there's a little on and an arrow, so if they're down, it means they're on. So what you have to do is you need to figure out what voltage you want to be giving your batteries. So I'm actually going to start with switch number 5. Currently I have it in the on position. Switch 5 is for lithium. If you have lithium, switch 5 should be off and facing up. If you don't have lithium, so it's AGM, gel, flooded, sealed lead acid, then that switch needs to be down in the on position. So this is the diagram you get. Switch 5 is on the other page and is to do with lithium. Switch 1 and 2 are to do with your absorption rate. Switch 3 and 4 are to do with your float charge. So the absorption rate is to do with the bulk charge, is how it translates. But it's like when your batteries are quite low and they need a ton of power, this is what will get fed to them. So the way that it works is these are kind of paired up. Switch 1 and 2 define the absorption rate, switch 3 and 4 define the float charge. With AGM batteries, I want my absorption charge to be 14.7. If you have different batteries, you're going to have to find out what voltage is most suitable, but for me, I've looked up 14.7 is fine. So what I'm going to do, I'm not 100% why both of these outcomes result in 14.7, but it doesn't matter. So I know that switch 1 needs to be on and switch 2 needs to be off. As you can see here, switch 1 is down, so it's on, and switch 2 is off. Then you need to set the float charge, and for me, it's 13.8. So I'm going to need switch 3 on, switch 4 on. And as you can see there, switch 3 is down, which is on, and 4 is down, which is on. So just to recap, 1 and 2 have set my absorption voltage to 14.7, 3 and 4 have set my float charge to 13.8, and number 5 is told it that it's not lithium. You'll get a diagram like this with your device, or at least you should. Just find out what voltage is most suitable for your batteries, and then set the switches accordingly. So mine's all rigged and ready to go. It's got the D plus connected in. It's got all the cables connected. So I'm going to get mounted up on these slats. So what I can do now is actually wire this to the batteries. And like I said, I'm going to use that live and this negative. I'm going to run these along the top of these. The other thing I need to do is fit a fuse on this cable. So I want that quite near the battery, I'll probably do it here and mount it there, and then just run the last bit of cable to it. So trim that to length, fit a fuse, then run the rest of the cable onto the battery. So if we refer to our diagram again, it tells you what fuses to use. We're here on the 60. It says the one on the starter needs to be a 90 amp or close, and the house battery needs to be a 75 amp or close. These breaker fuses that can be reset, they're a good investment, and they're really easy to set up. So I'm going to install the 80 amp one here in the back on the wall, and then this one's going to be in the front next to the main battery, and I'll take that through in a minute. It's worth noting that this is the negative from the van battery. Now, these cables are about 35 quid each at 5 meters, so they're quite expensive. So I was reading online because I was kind of thinking, well, surely the negative, as long as it's connected, like grounded, it shouldn't have to return to the battery. I looked online and it was one of those kind of debates where some people were like, yeah, you can do that, and some people were like, no, you shouldn't do that. So in the end, for the sake of 35 quid, I decided to wire it all the way back to the battery. But some people say that you can take this cable and ground it, but I don't know. If you're going to do that, please look into it yourself. I'm not recommending that. I'm going to stick by El Manuel on this one because it's always safer, and the risk of a van fire is terrifying. So 35 quid if it brings me a bit of peace. Anyway, back to what I said I was going to do. I'm going to get this cable cut, fuse in, blah blah blah. So with this fuse, you just take that little cap off. Inside there's a little barrel that the wire needs to go in, and then you've got this screw on the top that's actually an Allen key. So in this instance, that cable's actually thicker than this little barrel. But looking at it, that barrel doesn't really serve any purpose. There's no reason why I can't just put the cable straight into there and then screw this down, push that in, and then I'm just going to use the Allen key, which is just going to bite down on all the cable that's in there. This is tightening up nicely, which is giving me some confidence. I'm an idiot. Need to put the cap on the cable first. Now we should be in business. Just like that, and then screw that back on. And that's one end connected. Now this is the offcut, which is going to go from the fuse to the battery. So I'm going to connect it to this first, just like I did there. It's worth noting that if you push that button, that's the circuit open, no power will pass through. You flick that switch down, it's closed, and the current can go through it, no problem at all. So for the time being, I'm going to have that open, so that when I connect this to the battery, there's actually no current running through, just for a bit of safety. And then the very last thing I'll do once it's all installed is I'll put the two fuses on and we'll be in business. Now I'm just going to trim this end and get it connected to my battery terminal, which is over here. So I've screwed the fuse there, and I got my terminal on, and I'm going to connect this to the battery, positive onto there. And then I'm going to bring this negative along here and attach it there. Then it'll be a case of wiring up to the van battery. So that's all wired and ready. Positive and negative comes out. Positive goes through 80 amp fuse, which is currently open, and then connects to the positive of the first battery. The negative comes out and comes to the negative of the last battery. The D plus goes out and through to the cab, and so do the positive and negatives to go with the van battery. So now we need to go into the cab and wire these up. Here's those three cables. So batteries on here, I'm going to lift this lid off, I'm going to cut these to size. What I might do is actually run these cables alongside the seat and have the fuse here. It's not quite as close to the battery because the positive terminal's here. It's still very close. So there we have the 100 amp fuse. Currently got the circuit open, so no current flows through. I'm going to screw that down somewhere. Then we've got on the end of all these cables some terminals. So they're on the negative, the positive, and the D plus. So all I'm going to do now is connect the negative terminal on, the positive terminal, and the D plus terminal, and then I'll flick that breaker down so that the current runs through to the back. Then we'll go take a voltmeter reading on the batteries in the back and make sure that we're not getting any current coming from the battery to battery charger, because it should be looking for the van to be running through this cable before it does that. Negative attached, positive attached, D plus attached, all going through to the back. So I'm just going to engage the fuse by pushing that down. I'm going to go through to the back, and here we can see that it's detecting power from the battery. So now I'm just going to engage that switch, which means it's also connected to the leisure batteries, and that's not good news. So switch that off, and then that should climb back down. Right, because this detects the voltage on the batteries, what it's done is it's just climbed from 12.9 to 14 point something. That basically means that this is running. It's taking power from the van battery, boosting up to 14 volts, and then running it into leisure batteries, which is good. It means this works, but I've just had the realization that that shouldn't be wired to the battery. That needs to be wired to something that only engages when the van's switched on, because this green light shouldn't be on right now. It should only come on when the van runs. So this cable that I've connected to the battery is basically telling this system that it's always ready to charge, which is exactly what I don't want, because it's going to drain my van battery, which is why I've disconnected that. I need to go and find somewhere to wire this D+ cable to. Back of the stereo, or maybe there'll be a spare fuse slot under the steering wheel or something. I'm going to have to go have a look. So, I've decided what I'm going to do. I'm going to connect this into my cigarette port. I was reading online and everyone was saying the voltage that actually runs through this cable is minuscule. It's purely for detection. So I'm going to have to tap into this cable. The fascia's off at the moment, but I know that this USB port only comes on when the van's running. So what I'm going to do is splice into the side of this. I'll do it on this side of that fuse because it'll protect this cable, because it can obviously only carry so much. So what I've actually got is some of these. They're quite clever things really. What you do is you snap that onto a cable and it cuts the cable, but then it creates a connecting point in that gap there. So then you take this and put it on your other cable. So what that means is by attaching this to that cable and then this to my D+ sensor, I don't have to cut that cable at all, but I can detect whether there's current in it by sending it along that cable. So I'm going to feed this cable up behind all this plastic work, out of this hole, splice them together, pop that back in, and then see if everything works. So I've got my spade terminal on the D+, and now I'm just about to squash one of these onto here. I need to use a pair of pliers. So it should cut the wire and then click. That's all clipped on. And now I just connect this in here, feed all the cables back in, put my USB back into place, and then we'll go check the volt on the battery in the back. So I've just been in the back and the battery to battery charger isn't detecting any current from front of the van, and the solo charge controller is saying the battery's on 12.5. So I'm now going to take my key and start the engine. And what should happen is it'll enable this little USB, which also has the sense cable that's going to then run to the back and enable the charging between the batteries. Without further ado, so the van's running and the green light is on, which means it's detecting current through this cable here into the system. It's taking a load of power from the alternator. It's then converting it in there to whatever the leisure batteries are asking for and feeding it into them. You can see here that the solar charge controller is seeing that the batteries are on 14.4 volts, which means they're currently charging off the DC to DC charger. And just in the nick of time, because it's getting dark. And the phone's obviously compensating a little bit. But that means that's rigged and ready to go. So I'm going to leave that running just for a little bit because the batteries actually need charged up, and then I'll also make sure none of the fuses go. I need to put this back together. That little spade terminal, these little things, they're absolutely crap. I had it spliced onto that and it just wasn't reading anything, wasn't feeding through at all. So this is the cable that runs to the USB port, and then I've wired it into one of these little blocks, so it comes in there and then goes out there, charges the USBs, and then I've spliced in this one, which is the D+ detector. I'm just going to cover that in tape, feed that into the dash, put my USBs back in, cover the battery over, and that's me finished. Well, there you have it guys, that's how you install a DC to DC battery charger. If you have any questions, just drop them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them, and I'm sure the community will help out if I don't know the answer. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.